Hello and welcome. You are listening to Empowering Educators, a podcast about purpose-driven education brought to you by Voice of Purpose. I am the Real Sun, and today joining me for our podcast, we have Leroi Newbold, who is a community organizer, parent, educator, art curator for BlackLivesMatter Toronto. They're also an inaugural staff of Canada's first public Africentric school, and Leroi is also the director of BLMTO Freedom School, teaching children about Black pride and resistance through arts-based programming. So welcome, Leroi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So today we're here to kind of have a conversation about purpose-driven education, but also to kind of get a sense of some of the work that has been happening on the ground, through your work and kind of that general conversation around alternative education and arts-based spaces. So can you give us a sense of your own practice and where you're coming from as an educator?
Okay. Well, currently I work in the Africentric school. It's the first public Africentric school in Canada, and it's my 8th year working there. I also am part of Black Lives Matter Toronto, and I run the Freedom School there. So my work with education is very connected to my purpose in terms of Black liberation work and work for the freedom of our people in general. I see education as a big part of that, allowing kids and encouraging kids to participate in Black liberation work. And also looking at not only the state of emergency in terms of violence that our communities are experiencing, but also the quality of life for our communities. And education is a big issue there. In Toronto, 40% of Black youth don't graduate from high school. So that's part of what brings me to this work, for sure.
Yeah, and that's a huge statistic in terms of what is happening in terms of some of the youth that are in our schools, and speaking to, there must be these gaps, right? If so many of our children are failing, is it really the children that are failing, or is it the system that's failing us, right? So can you give us a bit of an understanding of kind of the principles that operate around Africentric driven education, and also some of the work that you guys have been doing at Freedom School with Black Lives Matter?
Well, in terms of principles that I operate, there's 3 things that I repeat a lot. Black children are Black gold. That's one. Black children are capable of complex political thought and political transformation. Is 2. And Black parents, families, and neighborhoods are a source of strength and power. So you were talking before about how a lot of Black children are failing in the education system. So it really recontextualizes that around the system itself, these principles. I say Black children are Black gold because it needs mentioning right now because of the context that we're living in. Because of the context of losing, 13-year-old Tyre King this month, 7-year-old Diana Jones, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, Alex Swetlaufer, to police killings. When these kids are killed and the state says it's okay, so kids and youth are watching things like this happening and watching with how our government and the public largely is okay with it, and that has a big impact on them. So my work with Black children is reaffirmation of their lives. They need to hear and feel that they matter, not only in terms of the context of the work that they produce at school, but as humans, as human beings.
And so what is the impact on children, do you think, when the messaging that is constantly kind of in front of them about who they are, whether it be from teachers, parents, the school system, media, and society in general, that they are not meant to succeed within a system, or they're kind of fed these images of violence, or these images that do not celebrate the beauty that they are? What do you find is the impact of that on youth? And
I think the impact on it is really profound because it's a feeling of disposability of Black life that you see all around you. And sometimes adults or teachers, especially white teachers or non-Black teachers, think that these type of conversations are too complicated or too grown up for Black children. So even though you're experiencing all these things happening around you, you don't have the chance to talk about them. Mm-hmm. And if you're not being given the tools to deconstruct your environment or deconstruct the things that are happening, then you internalize a lot of feelings about what you're seeing. So that's why the second part about Black children are capable of political thought and political transformation is important, because we need to help break these things down for them so that they can understand the world that we're living in. We are being oppressed. Why are we being oppressed? We can fight back. How can we fight back? We can win. How can we win? So we have to engage the kids in those conversations and not just avoid it because age.
Absolutely. And when youth are kind of reaffirmed in their beauty and reaffirmed in their ability to be positive contributions to society, I think there's something really powerful that happens. And I think that's part of the reason why I feel like purpose-driven education is such a powerful framework of looking at the way that we are educating our children, because, you know, purpose-driven education as a larger pedagogy, as we understand it, is the understanding that the purpose of education should be to help learners identify, align with, and build the skills to pursue their true purpose in life. And in that journey is definitely an important step is to reclaim your power, right? And I think for youth in generally growing up in this system, and people in general, like, definitely there's specific very negative implications that have been brought down from the system in terms of the Black community in particular, and also all communities of color, and just I think across the board there's been a lot of violence, internalized violence within people to say that we are not worthy, that we are kind of less than, or that we are not good enough, or that we shouldn't strive for the dreams that we have because, you know, there's that affirmation isn't there to tell us that we are worthy of that journey. And so I think with purpose-driven education, what's really powerful is the ability to tailor education around youth's particular interests, their uniqueness, you know. And last week with Derek Smith, we had started that conversation around culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive pedagogy, where you, when you tailor education towards a young person's cultural heritage and their background, you can bring so much more integrity to the way that they learn, and also affirming images to them of people who look like me who have succeeded, or people who look like me who can tell who tell me that I'm capable of more, you know. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this idea of purpose-driven education as kind of a larger lens of looking at our education system.
Well, yeah, I think that's really important. It's really important for educators to know that their purpose. First of all, like, my purpose as an educator is for Black liberation. It's the same as the purpose of everything else that I do. So my purpose then is making Black liberation history, movements, and practices accessible to kids. And I think it's also important helping kids to understand having an individual purpose, but also having a collective purpose pertaining to the health and freedom of our communities. So, you know, collective purpose, understanding our history so that we know where we come from, where we're going, we can understand where we're going. And then within that, we can locate our gifts. What can we contribute to a broader liberation movement? And in terms of that, we can look at, for kids, what's your blood power? Like, what is the power? What are the strengths within your family and community that you can bring to this collective purpose? So we could look at it like, for kids, what's your superpower for Black liberation? Or if you were a superhero, what would you want your superpower to be, so they know the areas that they want to grow?
I do that one all the time with my students. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so fun.
Yeah, it's so fun. Yeah. Yeah, and it's amazing when you can incorporate different aspects of learning that include play, that include arts-based practices, that include going beyond what the structure has currently set out, which is heavily centered around reading and writing as modalities that are privileged over others, and other modalities like art creation and music and critical pedagogy are things that kind of have taken a back burner. And I think, can you speak to some of the power in using these different sorts of facilitation modalities?
Yeah, I think that it can be a really good departure point for Black kids because of what we were talking about experiences within the education system that can make you feel like you're not as good as other people. I think arts-based practices can be a really good departure point because there's so much strength there, and it comes so naturally to kids, a lot of it, like in terms of our community. And so, like with reading, I would start talking to my kids about how there's so many ways to read people, or there's so many ways of reading. Like dance would be like a language where you have ways of like communicating and expressing yourself. Drama is a language as well. And so I tell them, you already know how to read in all these different ways, and then they feel that the experiences that they come with and the talents that they come with are already recognized. So it gives them more confidence for other academic endeavors, and you can transfer that confidence.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of something that I've been coming into an understanding as well as an educator. I think over the last especially 5 years, there's been definitely some more literature and more research centering around these ideas of multiple modalities and multiple literacies, and looking at from a critical place the ways that we have become used to associating literacy with it just being centered again on reading and writing, and now understanding that you can be literate in multiple modes, and not just reading and writing, but you can be literate in culture, you can be literate in dance, you can be literate in energy and reading a room, you can be literate in music, and in all of these different ways. And I think when we can encourage and even highlight to our youth all the ways that they are brilliant already, right? And I think that's truly the power of the work that we do with young people, especially in spaces where it's centered around social justice and spaces where it is centered around art creation, is this kind of open space and an invitation to our young people to say, hey, let's create this space together where we can celebrate who we are and also learn about our histories and give ourselves a depth of knowledge so that we can springboard and create more brilliance out into the world and tap into your truth and the gifts that you have to bring forward, and create a space to celebrate that in a society that typically hasn't created those spaces for us. I think that's really beautiful, and want to thank you for creating those spaces for young people, especially within the Black community, because we know there's been a lot of violence and a lot of stigma centered around the Black community from even communities of color as well, right? And other communities of color, and anti-Black racism is something that circumnavigates the world, and I think it's really important when we can celebrate the spaces that fight back against that stigma. So thank you for doing the work that you are. Any lessons coming out of the experience? Because I know Freedom School was a very specific kind of project that happened under Black Lives Matter over the summertime, a 3-week program for Black children between the ages of 4 and 10, was it? Yeah, can you speak to that experience really quickly?
Well, yeah, that was an amazing experience. It was amazing because it was a particular project, but it was also part of a movement that's moving towards self-determined education. Because the project itself was created by Black parents and Black youth. So we talked to Black parents and Black youth about what kind of things would be important to learn in terms of what's missing from their own schooling experiences and interests of youth and things right now. So that departure point was really important in terms of taking that power back in our communities to create our own alternatives. And then it was just a really amazing environment to be in, because it made me realize that we have the power already to create different realities. So we can resist against these systems like the education system that are oppressing us, but we can also just create what it is that we want to see. So the children had 3 weeks. They were learning about Black liberation in global diasporic context. So they learned about the Haitian Revolution, the Bassa Rebellion in Barbados. They learned about resistance from enslaved people here in Canada, like Mary Joseph Angelique. And then also they had the opportunity to create their own political action. So they were really interested in talking about incarceration and the rights of incarcerated people within their communities. After we started talking about, like, are Black people today really free yet, or are there certain people in our community who are really not free? So they decided to do an action about incarcerated Black Lives Matter. They did it in front of the U.S. Embassy, and they were fighting for, at the time there was one of the Black Lives Matter organizers was incarcerated in the United States, Jasmine Abdullah. So they did an action for her, and also for Matulu Shakur, who was an acupuncturist and Black liberation fighter who's still incarcerated now about 30 years later.
And why do you think it's important for young people, especially young Black youth, to engage in these sorts of activities and these sorts of learnings? What is the value of it?
I think it's important because they're learning how to resist. So they did their own action, they did their own promotion for it, they planned everything, they were speakers and they found other speakers. So they're learning how to do resistance. And I think it's also important challenging, like letting them broaden their idea of what Black Lives Matter means, because right now, especially in Black Caribbean communities, there's a lot of respectability politics that are still prevalent. So people will say, you know, that young youth was killed, but why? Was he associated with a gang, or was he this, or was he that? And so we were talking about how it really doesn't matter. Every person's Black Life Matters, including, you know, people who are incarcerated, including people who have been, you know, in criminal activities. It doesn't matter. So it was just letting them build that idea of what community means and their dedication to it.
And just before we close, I'm curious to, because I know some of our listeners may also have this question, is that there has been some critique around Africentric schooling and movements like Black Lives Matter saying that it's segregative, or that it takes a community and as opposed to uniting everybody under one front, that to kind of separate out a very particular way of engaging with culture in that way, it does more to divide. How would you respond to that?
I think that has a lot to do with the failure of the Canadian education system in terms of really teaching and letting people understand what segregation means and what it is. Because alternative education, or having the option of something else, is not segregation. Segregation is a political and imposed system. So where people will be told that they must be separate. And it's also to do with the quality of the type of the way the state treats you, the type of public services that you receive. Under segregation, Black people were separate but not equal. So the standard of education and the type of resources that were provided were very, very minimal. And in Canada, we already have a de facto segregated system. We have 900 reserves where Indigenous people live. And not only, but in terms of that, but we have de facto segregation in terms of the neighborhoods that we are living in. and the type of resources that those neighborhoods are provided with. So, for example, in Northwest 4 and Northwest 5 in North York, where I teach, there's no subway service. There is some schools in Toronto where the budget is made up, 80% of the budget will be made up based on parents' fundraising. And that makes a huge difference. With that fundraising, they can have a smart board for every classroom in the school. So we do still have, within our public education system, we do have segregation. We have some schools that are 90% Black, and the resources within those schools are scarce sometimes. So I think if we want to talk about segregation, we should, and that's important. But Africentric school is not an example of that, of segregation.
So it's like creating spaces where there is an opportunity for choice, and also addressing the fact that certain communities already are stepping into the game at a disadvantage because of the systemic histories of oppressions that we have lived through that already have created somewhat, of a segregation or a disparity between access to resources. And so it's about really a practice in equity to create more spaces where the Black community can gather, and any marginalized community wants to, if they want to organize a space to create spaces of empowerment, that's not necessarily segregation, but a community coming together to create options for greater liberation. Amazing. Thank you so much. Do you have any last words before we wrap?
No. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Leroi. For those of you that are,
I guess any parents or kids who are interested in checking out Black Lives Matter Freedom School, you can find it at freedomschool.ca.
Okay.
And we're going to be having a Halloween party. So we're dressing up like Black liberation figures and learning about who those people were in our history.
Amazing. So you can
find out more information on our website.
Awesome. So that was freedomschool.ca. And you are just tuning in to Empowering Educators, a podcast about purpose-driven education. Today, here with us, we had Leroi Newbold, who is an educator, a parent, art curator for Black Lives Matter, and also is a teacher at the Africentric School, one of Canada's first public Africentric school here in Toronto. Just want to say thank you, Leroi, once again.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners. This is The Real Sun signing off for Voice of Purpose. Until next time, take care.